So up until now, we've been working with our character that's been modeled in a neutral position. She's void of any sort of personality or emotion. Well, in this section on posing, all that's getting ready to change because we're going to bring her personality to the surface by posing her. Now, the best way to do that is to look at the concept art and to understand what our goal is, and then that's going to dictate the tools that we use and the techniques that we use to get there. Now, first off, I'll tell you that I changed the concept art a little bit. This is where we started, and I made a few subtle changes, mostly to her neck and her head placement. Okay, and I'll tell you why I did that. This is the action line, roughly, of the current model. But I like this one a little bit better because it's got more of an S shape. See, the hips go this way, the torso goes this way, and the head goes that way. All right, I just think it's a stronger shape that we can use, that we should use, versus this one. Let's have a look at maybe her weight. This is her center of gravity, and you can see that the weight is shifted off to one side. That creates an angle for her hips going one way, and an angle for her shoulders going another way to sort of counterbalance that. She's got a nice arc to her torso, and there's probably some twisting that's going on in her upper body too. Okay, so we need to figure out, she's got several things going on here. And so the way that I like to work is to work from general to specific. So I like to block in the big shapes first, or in this case the big forms or the big gestures, which is this weight shift over to one side, the angle of the shoulders versus the angle of the hips, the placement of the hand on her hips. I like to work that out first, and then once that's blocked in, we can sort of fine-tune the posing to better match our concept art. Okay, and what I mean by that is you can see that the characteristics of this drawing, see we've got some nice angles going on with her shoulders. Her shirt kind of flips out like that, really tight around her elbow. All right, so the way that I like to do it is to try and match the 3D as best I can to the 2D. So the concept art, so when we get to the 3D render, we're more in line with the concept art than if we just used a single approach, which might be to put a posing rig into the character. Now, I have found through experience that if I just rely on a rigged character to pose the model, it's a little bit limiting, and that these details, which are characteristic of the drawing, just get lost. Anyway, I like to do this in a multi-staged process, and I think for this example it's really going to work well for us. So let's hop over to Modo and take a look at some of the tools. Now, just so we can see the model better, I'm just going to turn on this clay material again. This gives us a little bit better viewing. Now, I made a model change to where we started. You can see that I've reduced the size of her hands and of her undershirt here. And I'll just toggle that on and off so you can see. So when you're working with concept art or turn drawings, it may or may not work in the 3D, and so you really need to sort of anticipate that and be willing to walk away from those turn drawings. Just use them for what they are, and then really sort of adhere to or cater to what it's going to look like in the 3D. But I could tell that these hands were a little bit too big the more I started to just look at them and work with them a little bit. So anyway, I think that model change is one that's going to suit us just fine. Anyway, one thing to note is that remember that we already have textures on this shirt. So the hands don't really matter so much because they're not really textured. I should say they're not UV'd. But the model change that we made on her shirt is negligible in terms of texturing. So we're all set with that. So moving forward with the tools that we're going to be using, again, this general to specific, big shapes first, we're going to block in. Let's just talk about that. So the first tool we're going to use is the skeleton tool. Now it's going to be responsible for drawing out the joints in our model. That's really the first step. Now the skeleton tool offers a lot of different things that we'll be using: intersection and then symmetry, so we won't have to draw out the left and the right, kind of as you would expect. The next thing that we'll do is that once our skeleton joints are in place is that we'll do a bind. So go to our Deformers tab, we'll hit bind, we'll talk about some of those options, and then what that's going to do is to attach the skeleton to our mesh so that we can effectively pull a joint here and there, and the full body IK that Modo has the model will follow it around. So the way that we're going to move these joints around leads us to our next tool, which is our pose tool. It's a really great tool. It's a really quick workflow. All right, and you'll see that as we start to use it. It's one of my favorite tools it's a very quick way to get to just do some exploration of moving the model around. We'll also want to address the weighting, because once we have the weighting established with a bind, it's not going to be what we want in the end. Okay, it's just a starting point. So we're going to look at some of these different tools by which to adjust the weighting, so that, in other words, as the elbow bends or as the shoulders change height, there's going to be some weirdness that goes on in some of those joints. Well, we're going to talk about how we use these tools to sort of smooth that out and set us up to, and we'll be in a better position to do more refining. So we'll talk about adjust weights tool and isolate weights, and then we'll use the painting tools. So we'll talk about that, and then finally we'll go to our actors. We'll create an actor for our girl, and then we'll create a couple of poses, and we'll talk about what actors are, how we use those poses and that workflow with, say, like adjusting weights or establishing and storing these different poses that we want to use. So with that, let's move forward and start with the skeleton tool. So before we start with the skeleton tool, let's get our scene sort of optimized for this stage of the process. So we've got 3 geometry layers right now: the girl, the eyes, and her hair. So what I want to do is just select all of those and then right click and go to merge meshes. I'm going to put all those together in just one geometry layer. Just relabel that. We're good to go as far as that is concerned. Now the next thing is that the lights that we have in place, they probably are going to get in the way, so we can hide those. Right, so we can either turn the geometry off just like that, or we can do what I like to do and turn them off but still have them render. So this is what I mean. If you select that layer, that geometry layer, in the Properties tab, you come down here to Mesh where it says Render. So by default, it comes in as yes. So it means that if you turn this off, it will not render. What we want to do is to change this default of yes to just yes. Okay, so it's going to render whether it's on or whether it's off. We're going to do that for each of these. So now let's start working with the skeleton tool. First thing is we want to make sure that our mesh is not subdivided. Okay, so just working with the raw polygons. Now I like to work in an isometric view for this part. So we'll select our skeleton tool and we'll draw out some joints. You want to make sure that in the tool properties for the skeleton tool that intersection is not ticked and that symmetry is off. So first let's just start off with the hip. Maybe we'll put one there for her waist, maybe the bottom of her ribs, up towards the collarbone, her neck, the top of her neck, and then her head. So if you come to a front view, if your skeleton is off center, that's easily fixed. Just double click the root bone, go over here to position X, and just hit 0. And that puts it right in the middle. That's exactly what we want. So with all that selected, let's reselect our skeleton tool, and this time we're going to turn on intersection and we're going to turn on symmetry. So let's select that collarbone, and it turns yellow, as you can see, and we're just going to draw out. This is probably better done in a perspective view. We're just going to draw out our skeleton just down the arms, and you can see that as I go to draw or just drop those in, that intersection tool property is going to put that locator right in the middle of that geometry. It's a really good way to do to work. It's a nice feature of that tool. All right, so one for the wrist, one for the big part of the hand. Select that wrist locator again, and then we're just going to roughly place our joints into each finger. So select that all the way around. Select which bone you want to, or which joint you want to use, and then just click on down the line. Okay, and I might want to reposition these just slightly. I'm not too terribly concerned with the placement, the specific placement. You just want to sort of eyeball it, because remember, this is sort of a rough pass, a blocking pass to get our big shapes established, our big gestures. Something like that. Let's do one for the thumb. Okay, great. So we have one side done, and then we have the other side done. Let's go down here to the root bone, the root joint. Do the same for the legs. Again, this is just sort of rough placement, just where I think I might want to move her. Sort of a rough fashion. All right, something like that. Now, I'm not concerned about the alignment of these locators. You can see that the axes are off on some of them. I don't really care about that right now. It's not something that we're going to be using. So the alignment of those locators doesn't bother me. All right, so let's double click, drop the skeleton tool by hitting the space bar, and double click all of those joints. And then we're going to zero out the position. So we'll zero everything out. So now every joint, this is what's called the setup mode for each joint. This is its home. So if we start to move this joint around, we can always get it back by typing in 0 in our position and rotation channels. So now we have our skeleton in place, everything's zeroed out. I think we're ready to move on to the binding part. So now that we have our skeleton in place, we need to attach that skeleton to the mesh. And the way that we do that is through a bind. Now, the first step of that binding process is to enter a mode that's called Setup. So we'll go into Setup mode by clicking the Setup button. You can see that the viewport turns blue, and we have this visual reminder around here, this yellow box that lets us know very quickly that we're in Setup mode. So we'll double click on the root joint, and then we'll shift click on our mesh, and then we'll go over to Deformers, and then under Bind, we're going to hit the Bind command. Now we have access to a few different bind types, and each model is a little bit different. With our particular model, all of these bind types will work except for heat, because we have overlapping geometry and we also have open geometry. So running a heat bind is just going to give you errors. It's not what we want, and we can just use rigid for our purposes. So that's what we're going to do. Going to run that command, and you can see that all of the different joints now have assigned a individual weight map. Now, if you're not seeing any weight maps, if you're not seeing any colors in this case, you want to make sure that your weight map's visibility is turned on. So if you hit O on your keyboard, go to Active Meshes and make sure that Show Weight Maps is on. If it's not, then you're not going to see anything. Want to make sure that's on. Or you can go from Advanced OpenGL to Vertex Map Mode, where you can click on a joint and thereby see its corresponding weight map. Okay? I like to work in Advanced OpenGL, so that's what we're going to be doing. So we'll come out of Setup mode, and you can see now that we select a joint, we've got this individual weight map that's been assigned to it all throughout all the joints that we've placed. And we have a bind. All right, so we can select our joint, and we can start to manipulate our model. So the last thing I want to mention before we move into the posing part is that what has happened behind the scenes. So you can see that in our Deformers tab, it's created a normalizing folder. And what that is a collection of all the deformers all being equalized or normalized so they're working together in conjunction with one another within this hierarchy. And then also, under weight maps, all of these joints, these are all of the weight maps that it's generated for us. So with all that said, let's work at starting to pose our model. So before we move into the actual posing, what I want to do is to store the position of our skeleton. And so the way that we do that is through creating an actor and a pose. An actor is basically just a collection of items, and in this case it's going to be all the skeleton bones that we have in place, or the skeleton joints. So let's double click on what we want to store. Alright, we're going to create an actor from those selected items. Let's just call this girl actor. From selected items, click OK. So next thing we want to do is to store this pose. So with the girl actor selected, go to poses and hit store, and we'll just call that start. And we want to make sure that under the source channels it's set to all. So I think by default it's going to be animated, so make sure it's set to all and then click OK. Alright, so now what we've got is we've got one actor, we've got one pose that's been stored. So that as we go and start to deform the model, say like this, and we want to get back to our original position, make sure that the girl actor is selected and that we have our start pose selected, and then just hit set. And then you'll see that that locator is going to snap back to its original position. Now, additionally, actors doesn't have to be the entire character. It can be parts of the character. Now, a good example of how you might use actors all within the same scene is to, say, create an actor for the hand. So you might have right hand as an actor, and then the pose might be a fist or a point. So you would load in actor, say, right hand, and then pose would be fist or pointing. So it works the same kind of way. I just wanted to mention that an actor doesn't have to be the entire hierarchy of a particular mesh like we have it. So now we're ready to move on. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is to bring in our concept art. Now, I want to use that as a backdrop to do all of my posing against, so we can match the pose to the concept art. First thing I want to do is to split this viewport. So I'm going to Control drag to the right. It's going to split that for me. I want to bring in a backdrop item. So I'm going to go to Item, Create Backdrop. It's going to drop in a blank item for me. Navigate over here to the backdrop image, select that, and we're going to load that in. Now by default it's going to come in as a front projection. We just click on that and go to camera. Now we don't see it yet because it's projected through the camera. So we need to change this viewport from perspective to camera. So go to camera, camera. I'm going to hide the girl mesh, and you can see that it doesn't quite look right. The proportions are off. Well, this is how we fix that. Go to the Shading tab, select on the Render node, and you can see under Frame, we've got our pixel dimensions that we've been using up until this point. So I know that the artwork that we brought in is 450 by 1000 pixels. Alright, so I'm going to punch that in, 450 by 1000, and you can see that now we're looking through a camera that is directly proportional to the concept art. Let's come back to our backdrop item, and then we have some controls over the opacity, and to me this is too bright. I need to see it, but I don't need to see it that brightly, so I'm just going to raise the transparency up to something that I'm comfortable with. Let's turn the model back on. And I think that's pretty good for us to start with. So we're good to go, ready to actually start posing the model now. Alright, so let's have a look at the pose tool. Now the pose tool works in conjunction with the skeleton that we have. So if we select the root joint, we go activate the pose tool, you can see that we've got these little dots that appear on all the joints. Okay, and all those are movable points for us. Now, what we can do is we can right click on a joint to lock it. It turns red, gives us an indication that it's locked, so that when we go to move the model around, those joints won't move. Now you can move them by selecting them by themselves and moving them, but they're locked if you try to move these other points. Another way that the pose tool works is if you hold the shift key and drag, you can see that it rotates from that particular joint. It's a really cool tool. I love using it, especially at this blocking stage. Now, if you've got a lot of points that are locked off, let's just say, a quick way to unlock all of them is just to right click off the model, and that resets everything. So what we're going to do is we're going to lock the legs, the feet, and we're going to use our viewport here to match up to the background image. So to get started with that, I like to optimize this viewport. So right now it's just kind of cluttered. So I'm going to hold the Control 1 key down. That's going to give me this pie menu. I'm going to toggle off the wireframe. I'm going to toggle off the locators, and I'm going to toggle off the grid. Then I'm going to hold the O key down. Let's see, toggle off. Go to Active Meshes. I'm going to select Show Weight Maps. I'm just going to turn that off too. So additionally, what I've done is to add a new material right on top, and it's this kind of transparent blue material. We can take a look at that real quickly. But basically the idea is that if we go to the Material Transitive Properties, you can see that the transparency amount is set to 40%. Now, if I want to see the concept art, I'll just increase the transparency amount, or if I want to see more of the actual model, I'll decrease the transparency amount. So using that idea, I'll set it to something like 30 or 40%, something like that. Okay, so this gives me a good idea of, I can see the concept art through the model, and especially for this blocking stage, it's really helpful. So now I have worked ahead, and I've got a new pose for us to look at. So I'm just going to toggle that off. If we go to our girl actor, down here to poses, this is our T pose, right? Our starting pose. If you go to pose 1, you hit set, you can see that now we've got, this is the model, this is the roughed in model. And you can see it does look pretty rough. And the reason it looks rough is because there's no weighting. It's all rigid, so it's pretty nasty looking. All right, so if that bothers you, then you can skip ahead and look at how we adjust the weighting, and then come back and then pose the model. But for me, that doesn't bother me. I know how to resolve, and I'm going to show you how we resolve all of these weird areas. It's not going to be completely resolved, but it's going to be good enough for us in this blocking stage, so that when we get to a more fine-tuning stage of the pose, we're all set. We have good clean geometry to work with. It's not all messed up like this. So with that, let's start the actual posing of the model. Alright, so let's get our neutral position back. So let's select that pose and hit set. It's going to give us our neutral position. And we'll activate the pose tool by first clicking on our root joint and then the pose tool. Now again, we want to think about big shapes first. Okay, so big first, general position first, and then we start to get a little bit more specific. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move her heels out into a general position that I think is good. I'm just going to lock that down. Alright, and then I'm going to take this joint and move that over. And I know that her weight's going to shift a little bit forward, so I'm going to just kind of pull her forward a touch. Probably lock off her hips. Again, right clicking on that joint, and then just sort of angle her back a little bit. Something like that. Unlock that joint, pull that over. You can see that I'm working in different viewports. And it's really important to get a good sense of the model, a good sense of the pose, right? So maybe lock that off, bring this over a touch, unlock it, bring it over a little bit more. Looking at the shoulder line, shoulder angle, something like that. I might want to hold the shift key down and twist her shoulders a little bit more. Lock that, bring it over. Constantly always sort of evaluating, right? So you'll work in a certain viewpoint rather, from a certain perspective, and then change your angle just to make sure that you're getting it right. Right? Let's activate that transparent material, and let's just twirl this up. Let's increase the transparency just so that we can see that working a little bit better. Alright, so bring it down a little bit. We'll keep it there for a minute. Unlock those hips. Just pull that hip over. Right? Again, think big movements first. Maybe that knee comes back a little bit. Something like that. I'm going to unlock that. I'm going to hold the shift key down. I'm just going to drag. Just going to go ahead and position that roughly. I can see some of her calf over there. Shift key. Just kind of angle that out a good bit. All right, and just move it back in line. And we'll do the same with this one. Just small movements, right? Now I see how it's coming up like that. I'm not worried about that right now. Okay, this is just general. Just sort of roughing it in. All right, we can always come back and adjust that, and we will. Let's shift her weight a little bit more towards this side. Looks pretty good. Unlock that chest. Turn her shoulders a little bit more. All right, that's pretty good. Let's say, why don't we lock that and sort of bring her head back in place. Something like this. Really move those shoulders out. Okay, she's got that hip out really far. Pull that over a little bit more. You can see that working this way, in a kind of a controlled way, you get a lot of really quick results. Again, this is just a blocking pass, so we're not worried about really specific placement, just general placement. I'm going to go ahead and move her hand over to her hip. I'm going to lock that wrist and pull that out, sort of get that in place. So something like that. Right? Unlock that. Maybe move that a little bit, move her wrist a little bit closer, something like that. I'm going to lock the palm right there, and I'm just going to pull this down. And actually what I might want to do, I'll lock the wrist too, and just go ahead and pull these fingers just down a little bit. Something like that. I'm going to unlock that wrist, and then now I can pull that elbow down. Oh, I forgot to lock these. I'm just going to right click on those and lock those fingertips, and then just pull that down a little bit. Maybe from that perspective. Something like that. Alright, pull that thumb out. We're getting there. Unlock that shoulder. Maybe pull that up. I don't want to move the head, so I'm just going to keep that locked right there. See if I can get there. That's good. Let's lock that thumb tip and see if we can just move that wrist up a little bit. You can see there's a lot of noise right here, so obviously we can't get to that right now, and that's all right. Lock that. Just move that arm a little bit forward. Lock that elbow. And then just sort of pull it back. Maybe lock that wrist. Something like this. And then let's just pull that wrist in a little bit closer to her body because she's going to be holding her purse. Something like that. So I think you could see what it is we're trying to accomplish here. So big shapes first, and just take some time. And it takes a little bit of practice to get it really fine-tuned. Sort of take your time with it. Start getting familiar with the tool. And you'll get some really good results. So work a little bit more on that, and then we're going to jump ahead to the final pose, the rough pose that we have, that we've already seen. Alright, so let's work on her hands a little bit. I'm just going to select the dress and the shirt. I'm going to hit J to lock that geometry. Again, going to grab the Move tool. And our blocking pass, we really have our fingers in a pretty good position. So I just want to bring back a little definition to some of the joints, just to make them a little bit sharper. Alright, so I'm just going to bring the geometry together to do that. I want to make sure that she doesn't look, her fingers don't look too knobby. Right, so you just want to tighten it up. You don't want to create too many hills and valleys. You still want some smoothness there. So you can see what I'm doing. I'm just moving the geometry around that we have, being sensitive to those hills and valleys, just tightening up that joint a little bit. All right, and a little goes a long way, so just sort of work your way around. Maybe smooth it off a little bit in certain areas, just to reduce the volume, smooth it, make it a little thinner. Something like that. I'm going to do that for all the knuckles. Just smooth that out a little bit. Okay. So now let's tuck in that shirt a little bit. See, it's coming into her fingers, coming into that shirt a little bit. Alright, just going to hit I to unlock our geometry. We'll select that shirt, and then we'll hide. I'll tell you what, let's lock the other geometry. So Shift J locks unselected. Then we'll hide that geometry selection so that we can see better what we're doing. Just sort of move that down a little bit. Again, sort of paying attention to how that fabric would react. Just a little bit. Now we need to create some wrinkles in here. I just want to give myself a little indication. We'll probably do that with a displacement map, just to create a little bit of added detail and tension right there. Okay, and I think that's about all I want to do there. So we can do that with the other hand, sort of refine that, but we need to drop her purse in. And then we'll move up to the head. So let's bring her purse in there. So we bring that geometry in, and let's select it. We'll go to item mode, and we'll just move this up into place. We've already bent the fingers, so we have a good idea of where it needs to be. We just need to create the right height and the right angle. Get it about where we want it. See? Just something like that. I think that's pretty good. Let's go to a left view, or let's see, just a right view, let's say. Okay. That looks alright. We might need to change the angle of her hand a little bit, but maybe not. I kind of like that. Okay, so come back to perspective. Let's go with that positioning of the purse. Maybe just turn that a little bit more. Something like that. Selection action center, and then sort of move it back a little bit. Maybe we'll just angle it slightly forward. That's cool. I think that's going to work for us. Alright, so now all we need to do is just sort of match, sort of bend our fingers around that handle. So go back to the girl, go to component mode, just hit 3, and make sure that our geometry is unlocked. Bring back our selections so we can see them. And we're going to use the flex tool. So let's grab a couple polygons, select that loop by hitting L, shift up arrow to grow that selection, and then shift Y gives us our flex tool. Sort of bend that around. Shift down arrow. It's going to shrink our selections. Get a good vantage point. I don't think that finger is going to be holding the weight of that purse, so I think we're alright. Sort of leaving it open like that. Alright, let's do the same with these middle fingers. Double click that geometry, grab that loop. Let's do the same over here. We're going to move these fingers together. So hit L for loop. Grow that selection a bit. A little bit more. Shift Y for the flex tool. Let's get a good vantage point. And then just rotate that into place. Shift down arrow. And then we can just move that over. Maybe shift down arrow one more time or two more times so we're not affecting that knuckle so much. And now we just can move that over a bit. Cheat that anatomy just a touch. That looks pretty good. So now let's come to our sculpting tools and just sort of, just like we did with the other hand, sort of move these knuckles down to create, again, that sharpness, just to get that sharpness correct on her knuckles. That pinky looks a little bit distorted, so let's correct that. Grab that loop, shift up arrow. Let's get a good perspective. Shift up arrow one more time. Shift Y for the flex tool. And then shift down arrow to shrink our selections. And then just sort of negotiate that into place. Move tool to do some final tweaking on that hand. Okay, pretty happy with that. The thumb's in a pretty good position. Not going to really touch that much. You might want to come back and just sort of tweak some of these other sections, these other joints, being sensitive to the anatomy. Again, we want to make sure that she has really clean fingers so that's not like too knobby. So just try to make that as clean as you can. Alright, I'm pretty happy with that. I might tweak it a little bit more, but overall I think we're good to go. Alright, so let's have a look at the head. Let's hide our other geometry. So we'll bring our selections back. We'll double click all the information in the head, hit Shift H, and then let's turn on this transparent material again. And I think the first thing I want to do is just sort of reposition the head a little bit better. So we're going to go with a selection action center and hit Y, and maybe use our camera viewport to just twist her head a little bit more towards us. and these are sort of micro movements, but move that over a little bit. That's all right. And then let's get the angle of that neck right. All right, so I'm going to bring back my selections so we can see everything. And I'm just going to isolate the neck. Control to deselect those, paint select those. All right, shift up arrow to get that information. And then now I'm going to use an action center of selection border. Just going to hit Y. And I'm going to just move this over to get that angle. Just rotate it. Spacebar to drop the tool. And it's looking pretty good. I think we've got that. Alright, so let's just turn our clay material on so we can see that a little bit better. So now let's bring back our geometry and we'll hit U. And then we just need to tuck in the lower part. Should to bend this back. Alright, so select those two polygons. L, grow that selection. Shift Y to get our flex tool. And let's just move that into place. Something like that. That looks pretty good. I'm just going to double click. Actually, I'm just going to, let's just grow that selection a little bit. So I'm just going to select that loop, shift up arrow. All right, so we're just going to work on that. We're just going to hide the selections. And I'm just going to move her neck over a little bit more because that scarf has some transparency to it. We want to make sure that her skin is inside her shirt. We can smooth that out a little bit more. Smoothing it, holding the shift key down, getting a good vantage point. Just move that skin back. Okay. I think that's good enough. So the next thing we're going to do is to bring her eyes around so that she's looking at us. So we're going to toggle off our clay material so we can have a better idea of where her irises are. There are a number of different ways that we can do this, and it all depends on your output. But we're working with a single image, and so if my needs are simple, I'll just go with the most direct way. So we've got separate geometry for her eyes. I'm just going to middle mouse click on that, control click to deselect what I don't want, and then just double click that eye. All right, now I'm just going to hide my selections, and just with the rotate tool, I'm just going to rotate that eye around till I feel like it's a good position. Maybe down just slightly. A little goes a long way with rotating those eyes. Something like that. Maybe a little bit closer. Maybe a little bit more. Sort of tweak it back and forth a little bit. Alright, we're going to do the same for this one. Bring back our selections, middle mouse drag, deselecting what we don't want, just double clicking, hiding our selections, rotate tool. Now sometimes the eyes don't look in the same place. Okay, so it depends on what it is that what you're focusing on. So I tend to sort of separate those out when I'm bending them around. So the eyes also are spherical, so we don't have to worry about the eye as we rotate it breaking through the skin or anything like that. So I think that's pretty good. I might want to tweak that as we get a little closer, but that's generally the way that we do the eyes. Again, just sort of match that output, And for our particular case, this direct approach I think worked pretty well. So when it comes to creating different facial expressions, I like to have a flexible solution to accommodate different emotions. So whether it's a smile or a smirk or a frown, I need some sort of flexible tool that will allow me to explore these things quickly and then come back to my original pose and explore something else. So the way that I like to do that is through the use of a morph map. So we're going to have a look at that, but let's first talk about what a morph map is. So a morph map is an alternate position for the current position of the vertices. What we'll do first, just to sort of get things going, is to make sure that we have our girl selected. We're going to create our first morph map, call it Smile. And you'll notice that when you create that morph map, it's going to populate down here in the lower right-hand corner of your viewport. So that's just a convenience. So if you happen to be on another tab, it's still down here so you can tell that that's the morph map that it is that you're working with. Now let's just target the geometry that we want to work with. I'm going to select those polygons, shift up arrow to grow my selections, and I'm just going to hide my selection so we can see that a little bit better. We're going to move this lip up a little bit. I think that's the first step to creating her smile. Something like this. And then just sort of work your way around a little bit. Okay, we're going to bring back our selections. And now with everything selected, just the skin of the face, I'm going to hide my selections again and continue on with that expression. All right, so I use the sculpting tools quite a bit to do this. It's a great method for quickly creating these morph maps. So I'm just going to do a little bit more on this, and then we'll talk a little bit more of the workflow. Now her smile is sort of subtle, so a little goes a long way when it comes to a smile. Something like that. Alright, so let's just say that that's perfect. That's what we want. So you can see that our morph map is down here. It's on. We can turn it off by just clicking over here in the type. Alright, so it's off now. That's the first step. So we've created our morph map. Now we need to create a morph influence so that it can actually render. And the way that we do that is just right click on the morph map and go to add morph influence. Alright, so that's added a morph influence to our girl. If we turn this morph map off in the viewport, I just want to point something out, what that's done for us. So if you hit O on the keyboard, you can see that we have our viewport properties pop up. In our Model Quad tab, we by default enable deformers is off. Okay, if we turn that on, then the deformers that we have in the scene will come on. Just like now we have that morph influence on her lips, on her mouth, that expression. So off and then on. So just something to be aware of. Now I like to keep, in this particular viewport, I like to keep the deformers off. Alright, but now we know that we have a morph map. It can render because we have a morph influence on it. And that's a good start for this section. So we're going to relabel that as Smile, just so we can keep track of it as we add more morph deformers in here. We'll have a few of them, and it's kind of a tidy way to work, just to keep things organized. Alright, so when you're happy with its smile, let's create another morph map. We'll call it Hair. I'm going to select the geometry we want to work with. L for that loop. Just grow that selection out a little bit. And let's use our flex tool, so Shift Y. Just get a good perspective. We're going to create that little flip of her hair out there. Alright, so Shift down arrow. It's going to shrink our selections. And I'll often use this outer gray ring. It sort of gives me some clean shapes and I won't change my vantage point in the viewport. I'll just keep it the way it is. Won't move around until I'm finished with that tool. So I have a nice clean bend to that. So that's a pretty good place to start. I want to make sure that my geometry is selected that I want to work with. I don't want to move the cheek, her skin or anything else around. So I'm going to hide my selections, get my sculpting tools. Now you want to be sensitive to the areas that you already have textured. And we've got a lot of texture in her hair, so we don't want to move that around too much. We can move it around a little bit and not get in too much trouble. But I really want to look at that silhouette and try to hit that silhouette as best I can. So we can move this around just a little bit more. And I think we'll be just fine. I just want to show you that. Now I'll just continue to work my way around the model. Let's just do this ponytail too. Alright, so I'm just going to middle mouse drag over that. Be helpful for you to see what I'm doing. So I'm going to turn my selections back on. Just middle mouse drag over that geometry and then double click it. I'm going to deselect by holding the control key down, something like that. And then I'm going to use my flex tool again. I'm just going to bend that bit of hair back a little bit. Just round it out. Kind of tuck it back behind her shoulder. A little bit more. Okay, something like that. You can see it's starting to come more in line with that concept art. We're getting there. Let me just show you a couple other things. We won't be doing all of it, but I'm just going to show you one thing about the morph map. So say we're wanting to bend that section. So we've taken some time, we've bent it, but it's not in a good position. Okay, that's not what we want. All right, we've already dropped the tool, but we want to get that back to where we started. So let me just show you how to do that. So we select the troubled area, hit L, just shift up arrow. So we've selected all that. Now if you go to your morph map, just right click on it and go to clear. All that geometry that we've pushed around in that morph map is going to be stripped out of that particular morph map. Okay, so that's a really good way to work. I'll sometimes do that. I'll like a certain section and there's a certain part I'd really want to start over on, so I'll use that quite often. So the next thing I want to do is to create a deformer from here, so a morph influence. We know how to do that. Right click on it, add morph influence. You can see under our girl item we've got this morph influence. Just going to go ahead and relabel it to be tidy. So now we can see we've got a hair morph, we've got a smile morph, and if I turn off the deformer, or if I turn on the deformers rather, so hit O, you can see that we can see both of them at the same time. Okay, so we're seeing the smile and the hair at the same time. Alright, great. I think the next thing we need to do is to address her eyes, and we'll do that next. So the final morph map I want to create for her face is going to address her eyelids. So we modeled them sort of sleepy, just to give us a little bit more flexibility in terms of emotions, but they're a little too sleepy in the viewport and the camera view, so we want to change that. So let's create a morph map to bring those eyelids up. I'm just going to get rid of the geometry. I'm just going to hide that to get it out of our way. Select the geometry, hit H. Now what I want to do is we have separate geometry, one for her eyelashes and it's separate from her skin. Alright, so with her eyelash completely selected, 2 polygons on that row, hit L and shift up arrow a couple of times to about right there. I'm going to hold the control key and just middle mouse drag around those areas that I don't want to influence. Something like that. I'm going to get a good vantage point next, because what we're going to do is rotate our eyelids back, just to give us, just so we can see her eyes a little bit more. Something like that. So I'm going to line up this edge of her eyelid with the inside edge of her eyelid. Something like that. I want to use a selection fall off and hit the E key for our rotate tool. Make sure that we have an automatic action center so that we can freely click wherever we want to position our widget, right? So we've got our position. Let's just see, maybe about right there. I'm going to use this gray handle to rotate that eyelid back. It's probably a little too high, so let me just re-click, bring down a little bit. It still might be a little high, bring it down a little bit. Okay, something like that. I think that's pretty good. Now to better see what we've done, I'm just going to turn on this clay material again so we can see the actual geometry. And that's pretty good. That's not too bad. I might have a little penetration right there, the eyelid coming into the eyeball. Okay, I'm just going to hide my selections. I'm going to use my move tool. I'm just going to bring that up slightly. And then I'm going to bring this down and better match it. Just bring it in close to that eyeball. Get a good vantage point when you're doing all this work, because we've got a lot of stuff going on. Okay, and I think that's a pretty good solution. Something like that. Alright, cool. Now I'm going to pause the video, I'm going to do the other eye, then I'm going to show you one more thing about the morph map, and we'll be done with the eyes. Alright, so now with both eyelids done, we're ready to create a deformer from that. So let's right click, add a morph influence. We'll right click on that, call it eyelids. We'll bring back our geometry by hitting U so she can have a better look at her. So now what I want to do is I want to enable our deformers in this viewport. So right now we can see the eyelids morph, we can see the hair morph, and the smile. Alright, so if I hit O, I'm going to enable deformers so we can see them all together. Pretty cool. So the final thing I want to show you about this is that every deformer that we have, every morph influence that we have, we can control the strength. Alright, so if we select eyelids, she looks very excited right now, but maybe a little too hyper. So let's just calm her down a little bit. And we can lower the strength of that morph influence, maybe like 65%. And you can see with deformers enabled, we can control this really low too. So 25%. Towards the end of the day, she's a little sleepier. Or we can overdrive it, 115%. Okay, so she's had her coffee, she's ready to go. So I think for this example, we're going to go with something like 55%. Good deal. So we have control over all of the morph influences in terms of strength. So keep that in mind should you want to tweak or expand an expression or subdue an expression. It's a good thing to know. Alright, we're ready to move on now. So the last big part of this refinement pass is to address her scarf. Okay, so we're going to make sure that our deformers are disabled. We're going to hide the geometry we don't want to work with and just focus on the scarf. Now, Modo offers a lot of different ways to do deformations, right? You can have a bend deformer, a spline deformer, you can use the skeleton tool, whatever you're more comfortable with. For me, I like to use morph maps and I like to use the flex tool, so that's what we're going to go with. Now, what I want to do first is we have our item selected, scarf, hit new map, new morph map, and just call it scarf. And what we'll do is we'll work with one at a time. So I'll select that one, hit H to hide it. You can see again down here we have our name of our morph that we're working with. And then just using some of the techniques that we started with, let's work on this. So what I want to do, I'm just going to sort of eyeball this into place to get this big shape in there first. And then in item mode, I'm just going to in component mode, bring on my selection so we can see it. Just going to select that geometry and I'm going to create a nice little bend. Alright, so shift Y, and we're just going to sort of work our way around. So shift down arrow, just to create that nice little start. Something like that. And then we'll come down here, maybe select that area, Shift Y, sort of work our way back, doing it like this. Alright, so I'll work in a certain viewport for a little while to get that little curve. Then I'll shift over. Let me see, I'm going to bring my girl so that I can see how that's looking. Okay, and now I want to sort of bend that forward. So I'm going to go grow my selection a little bit more. I'm going to create this little bend to the end of it. Alright, so again, Shift Y. And get a good vantage point, and that's pretty good. Shift down arrow, just sort of work your way around. And this is kind of a creative process, kind of something that you can sort of take your time with. When I'm creating a bigger shape like this, something that's really flowing, I want to make sure that I keep it as clean as I possibly can in terms of a bend, right? So this is sort of a gradual process, just sort of a lot of little strokes just to get that, just to make sure that it doesn't twist or kink or whatever. I really want to retain the integrity of that clean shape, so I don't bend it too much with each time that I use the flex tool. Just enough. Grow my selections, pull it around a little bit more. Okay, something like that. So let's just take a little evaluation of it. Okay, so that bend is starting to happen. Alright, so let's just move this up. Let's see where we're at. Just move that up into place. Select the end of it, Shift up arrow. Something like that so I can see it from here. Shift Y, flex tool. And again, just working in some different viewports so that I can get a good idea of what that's going to look like. Just going to bend it up first. Alright, so Shift up arrow will bend this up a little bit more, just to get that upper lip of that tip of that. Okay, that's good enough to work with. Good. Let's select that area. Now I want this to tuck into the scarf around her neck. Okay, so let's do that. So Shift Y, bring this back up. Again, sort of in a gentle way. And this is going to be behind her, but still kind of important. There's also some twisting that we need to have happen, but we can probably turn this whole thing. Alright, so let's do that. Let's just hit Y and just turn this whole thing a bit. Again, just sort of using the modeling techniques that we've been using. I'm going to bend this now more towards her body and tuck it into that area. Alright, Shift Y, flex tool. Come up a little bit more just to sort of tuck that down in there. Shift up arrow, Shift down arrow. And just sort of negotiate that in there a little bit more. Alright, it's looking pretty good. Pull it up, down, up a little bit more, and then tuck it in there. Okay, cool. Now we can always come back and finesse that shape so that it tucks in a little bit more. So this is, remember that we took out one side of this. So this is just a single-sided polygon. Okay, so we can't really select it from this side. but that's alright. We can just hit F to flip the polygons, and so now we can, should we prefer to work from this angle. So I'm just going to get a bigger brush, or my move tool, and just sort of bring this together. Should we want to do a turntable or something of her, at least we'll have a nice shape in the back. And it's sort of believable to have that sort of taper in, because it's going to wrap around her neck. So let's work on the end. There's some characteristics of the drawing I want to definitely capture. So I'm just going to use my concept art to sort of pull this up into place. Now we've got a texture on here, you remember, so you don't want to distort this too much. So be a little bit gentle about that, as you just be mindful as you start to move stuff around. Sort of pull in here, get that tight little point. The kind of bending that we're doing, the kind of deformation that's happening here is really, it's not a big deal. Okay, the texture is not it's not going to distort too badly. We can also work within this camera view, should we really want to dial that in super close. So we can flip our geometry back by hitting F. And again, just sort of working around to make sure that we have a good smooth curve. Okay, keep things really simple. Things that are flowing like that, you know, you want to keep those simple. Simple and clean lines. So that's good. So that's one. Using the same techniques, we're going to do the other. Alright, so with a little bit more work, we've resolved the shape of the scarf. It matches up in our concept art pretty well. I like the way that it works in the 3D view as well. So I'm happy with that. We're almost ready to move on. But just kind of as a final note in this posing section, I want to address a couple of things. One is that up until now we've been looking at these individual shapes, you know, so we've been working in this kind of isolated areas. So the hand, then we've moved over to the elbow, you know, up to the face, you know, we've resolved those. But it's really important that you take a step back from working from in a segmented fashion to look at the entire model as a whole. Just do a couple of test renders just to see how it's looking for you, and then you can better evaluate that. So as you know, individually, you know, things might be working. So I might really like this hand, but there might be something strange going on with the forearm or up into this area. So anyway, the point is just to do an evaluation to bring it closer to our concept art. You can see that I've sort of dialed in a smile that I like. I sort of sharpened up her chin a little bit, shaved off a little bit of area on either side of her jaw, just to better match it to the concept art. And I want to encourage you to do that too. Just sort of take a step back. Now, the last thing that I want to do with the refinement pass is to create this displacement map for these wrinkles in her shirt. Now we've done a displacement map on her hair, so using those same techniques, targeting that outer shirt UV, creating a displacement map, I'm going to put that in place. So when we enter into the rendering section, that'll be done and in place, and I think that's a really good characteristic. It's going to create some tension of right there at that little junction, and I think that'll be a nice little detail. Alright, so with that, I think we're ready to move on to rendering.